The night my daughter-in-law threw a glamorous party at my own oceanfront house, I was not inside celebrating. I was sitting alone in my car down the street, watching strangers toast under lights I had paid for. 100 guests laughed on my porch while my name was not even on the guest list. My own son stood beside her like I did not exist. That was the moment I realized something painful. They thought I would stay quiet forever. They thought I would accept being erased from my own life. They were wrong, because that night I made one phone call that changed everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you will not want to miss. Let's get started. People often think that the moment everything falls apart is loud and dramatic. In truth, it rarely is. Most of the time, the turning point arrives quietly, disguised as something ordinary. For me, it was a single phone call that came on a warm afternoon early last summer. At the time, I believed it was the beginning of something good. I did not know that weeks later, I would be sitting in my car outside my own house, watching strangers celebrate on my property while I dialed the police. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 69 years old, and until recently I believed I understood how the world worked. I believed that if you worked hard, treated people kindly, and put your family first, things would eventually turn out the way they were supposed to. That belief carried me through most of my life. It carried me through marriage, through motherhood, and through the long, quiet years that came after my husband passed away. My late husband, Daniel Whitmore, was a shipyard worker for most of his life. The job was not glamorous, and it was never easy, but Daniel took pride in it. His hands were always rough from steel and salt water, but he never complained. For nearly 40 years, he worked long shifts along the docks, while I managed our household finances and worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small family business in town. We were not rich, not even close, but we built our life carefully, one paycheck at a time. Our greatest shared dream was a small beach house in Cape May, New Jersey. It took us more than 2 decades of saving to afford the land. I still remember the first time we stood on that quiet stretch of coast, staring out at the Atlantic Ocean while the wind whipped across the sand. Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulders and said that one day we would sit on that porch together as old people and watch our grandchildren play in the yard. For him, that house represented peace after a lifetime of work. When we finally built it, the house was simple but beautiful. A wooden structure with wide windows facing the ocean, a long porch that caught the evening breeze, and a small garden where Daniel planted seagrass and hydrangeas. He repaired most of the place himself, spending weekends fixing railings, painting walls, and polishing the old hardwood floors until they shined. Every corner of that house held a piece of our history. Daniel died 4 years ago after a sudden heart attack. Since then, the beach house has felt both comforting and painfully quiet. I kept everything almost exactly the same, as if preserving it might somehow keep his presence alive. Our only son, Ethan Whitmore, lives in Philadelphia now. He works in real estate and has built a successful career for himself. I was always proud of the man he became. When he married Samantha Blake 2 years ago, I tried my best to welcome her into our family. Samantha was confident, stylish, and ambitious. She worked in marketing and seemed to live comfortably in a world that moved much faster than the one I understood. She was always polite to me, but something about her smiles felt distant, as though I belonged to a different era entirely. At first, I ignored those feelings. Families take time to adjust, I told myself. Then one afternoon, early last summer, Samantha called me. Her voice sounded unusually warm. That call was the moment everything began. If you are still watching, and this story already has you curious, comment number 1 below, so I know you are here with me. What happened next completely changed the way I saw my own family. Now, let us move on to chapter 2. The phone call came on a warm afternoon in early June, the kind of quiet coastal day that makes time seem slower than usual. I was standing on the back porch of the Cape May house, watering the hydrangeas Daniel had planted years ago. The ocean breeze drifted across the yard, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seagrass. It was one of those peaceful moments when the world feels steady and predictable. My phone began to ring on the small wooden table beside the porch railing. When I looked down and saw Samantha's name on the screen, I hesitated for a moment before answering. Samantha rarely called me directly. Most of the time, if we communicated at all, it was through short messages or brief conversations when Ethan was nearby. I wiped my hands on a gardening towel and answered. Her voice sounded unusually warm that day. It was the kind of tone people use when they are trying very hard to be pleasant. At first, I wondered if something had happened. Instead, she quickly explained that she had exciting news. Samantha had just received a promotion at the marketing company where she worked. She sounded proud, and for a moment I felt genuinely happy for her. Career success had always been important to her, and I knew she worked hard to maintain that polished, confident life she seemed to carry everywhere. Then she told me she wanted to celebrate. Not with a large corporate event, she explained, but with something small and personal. A gathering of close friends for a weekend by the ocean. She asked if Ethan and she could use the Cape May house for the celebration. She emphasized several times that it would be simple and intimate. Only a small group of people. Maybe 20 guests at most. Just friends, some good food, and a relaxed evening by the water. I remember feeling oddly touched by the request. Of all the places she could have chosen, she had asked to use my house. That small detail made me feel included in a way I had not expected. Of course, I agreed immediately. In fact, I went further than she asked. I told her I could drive down a few days early to prepare everything. The house had been quiet for most of the spring, and it would take some work to make it ready for visitors. I offered to clean the rooms, arrange flowers, and even help organize the food if she wanted. Samantha did not hesitate before accepting the offer. At one point, during the conversation, she said something that caught my attention. She mentioned that Ethan had told her I enjoyed organizing gatherings like this. The words were casual, almost playful, but they left a faint sting that I could not quite explain. It sounded less like appreciation and more like I had been assigned a role. Still, I brushed the thought aside. After we ended the call, I stood on the porch for several minutes, looking out toward the ocean. For the first time in a long while, I imagined the house filled with people again. I pictured laughter drifting through the open windows and music playing softly in the background while the evening sun faded over the water. Daniel would have loved that scene. That house had always been meant for for gatherings, for moments of celebration. The idea of people enjoying it made the quiet rooms feel less lonely. I went inside and pulled a small notepad from the kitchen drawer. Almost without thinking, I began writing a list. Cleaning supplies, fresh flowers, outdoor lights, extra chairs for the porch. The more I wrote, the more energized I felt. Looking back now, I realize how hopeful I was that afternoon. I believed Samantha's call meant something important. I believed it was the beginning of a warmer relationship between us. What I did not realize then was that the phone call had already set everything in motion. If you are still watching and starting to feel that something is not quite right, comment number 2 below to let me know you are still with me, because the next moment was when the first real warning sign appeared. Now, let us continue with Chapter 3. After my conversation with Samantha, I drove back to Cape May 3 days earlier than planned. The house had been quiet since late spring, and I knew it would need some attention before welcoming guests. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of salt air and old wood greeted me. Dust had settled on the window frames, and the curtains hung still in the quiet rooms. It felt peaceful, but also a little lonely. I set my bags down and opened every window in the house. The ocean breeze drifted through the rooms, carrying with it the steady rhythm of waves from the shoreline a short walk away. That sound had always made the house feel alive. For the first time since Daniel passed away, I imagined laughter echoing through the hallways again. I began cleaning immediately. I wiped every surface in the living room, polished the wooden floors Daniel had worked so hard to install, and carried fresh linens upstairs to the guest bedrooms. The work was slow and tiring, but it felt meaningful. Each task reminded me why the house existed in the first place. Daniel and I had built it so people we loved could gather here. The next morning, I turned my attention to the yard. The grass had grown uneven along the fence line, and the flower beds needed trimming. I spent several hours pulling weeds and straightening the hydrangea bushes that lined the front path. By the time I finished, the garden looked bright and welcoming again. As I worked, I pictured Samantha's friends arriving and walking toward the porch with the ocean behind them. I imagined them standing along the railing, talking and laughing while the evening sun dipped toward the horizon. The thought made the long hours feel worthwhile. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to arrange a few extra things for the gathering. Even though Samantha had described the party as small, I wanted everything to look beautiful. I rented a large white tent that could be placed in the backyard in case the weather changed. I also ordered several arrangements of fresh flowers from a local shop and reserved outdoor lights that could be strung between the porch posts and the trees near the fence. By the time I finished making the arrangements, the total cost was already climbing into the thousands. I told myself it was not important. This house had always been meant for celebrations, and I wanted Samantha's event to feel special. 2 days later, Ethan and Samantha arrived to look over the preparations. I felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness when their car pulled into the driveway. I hoped Samantha would see how much care I had put into everything. When she stepped out of the car, she walked slowly through the yard, studying the tent and decorations with careful attention. At first, she said very little. Then she began making small observations that felt less like compliments and more like quiet criticisms. She mentioned that the furniture on the porch looked a little outdated and that the decorations felt somewhat traditional. She also commented that the garden still seemed a bit overgrown near the fence. Ethan stood nearby scrolling through his phone while she spoke. He glanced up occasionally, but never said much about the work that had been done. I nodded politely and told myself not to take the comments personally. Samantha had always cared about appearances, and perhaps she simply had a different sense of style. Still, as she continued walking through the house, pointing out details she would prefer to change, I noticed something that unsettled me. She moved from room to room with the confidence of someone inspecting her own property rather than visiting someone else's home. At the time, I ignored that feeling. I told myself the only thing that mattered was making the weekend a success. If you are still watching and wondering how things could possibly get worse, comment number 3 below so I know you are following the story. Trust me, what I discovered next was something I never expected. Now we move on to Chapter 4. In the days after Ethan and Samantha inspected the house, I continued preparing for the weekend as if nothing had happened. Their visit had left me feeling unsettled, but I told myself that my reaction was probably an overreaction. Samantha simply had different tastes. Younger people often did. So I focused on the work. The catering company called to confirm the delivery schedule, and I walked them through where everything should be set up. I arranged the flower centerpieces on the dining room table to make sure the colors matched the ocean view through the windows. I tested the outdoor lights that would hang between the porch and the trees near the garden fence. By late afternoon, the house looked beautiful again. The tent stood neatly in the yard, the porch furniture had been cleaned and polished, and the ocean breeze carried the soft scent of fresh flowers through the open doors. Still, something about the atmosphere had begun to feel different. Samantha moved through the house with an unusual sense of authority. When vendors arrived, she spoke with them confidently, directing where things should go and making small adjustments to the arrangements I had already prepared. She rarely asked my opinion. Instead, she explained her ideas as if the house naturally belonged to her. At first, I tried not to notice. I reminded myself that it was her celebration, and she probably felt responsible for making sure everything looked right. But one afternoon, something happened that made it impossible to ignore the feeling growing inside me. I was in the kitchen organizing serving trays when I heard Samantha outside on the back porch speaking on the phone. Her voice carried through the open window. She was describing the house to someone, explaining how perfect the location was for hosting people from her professional circle. I could hear excitement in her tone as she talked about the ocean view and the space in the yard for the tent. Then she laughed lightly and said something that made me freeze where I stood. She mentioned that the owner would not be around during the event, so everyone would feel comfortable. For a moment, I thought I must have misunderstood what she meant. I told myself there had to be some other explanation. Later that evening, I walked through the dining room and noticed a stack of printed papers lying on the table. At first, I assumed they were vendor receipts or decoration notes, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a guest list. Curiosity made me pick it up. The list ran several pages long. Name after name filled the pages in neat alphabetical order. Business contacts, social media personalities, colleagues from Samantha's marketing firm, and people I had never heard of before. I counted roughly before the realization sank in. There were more than 150 names. My heart began beating faster as I flipped through the pages again. Samantha had told me the gathering would be small, 20 people, maybe a few more. But this was not a small gathering. This was a full-scale event. Then I noticed something else. I searched the list carefully, moving line by line with my finger. My name was not there. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Perhaps she had written it on another page. Perhaps the list was incomplete. But the more I checked, the clearer the truth became. I was not invited. Later that evening, I asked Ethan about the guest list. He barely looked up from his phone before explaining that Samantha had expanded the invitation list because many people from her professional network wanted to attend. He spoke about it casually, as if the change were completely normal. But his explanation did not answer the question that mattered most. Why was I not included? The unease that had been quietly growing inside me finally became something sharper. And when I checked the permit documents Samantha had submitted for the event, the feeling turned into something much worse. On the form listing the property owner, Samantha had written her own name. My name was nowhere on the document. If you are still watching and feeling the tension building, comment number 4 below to let me know you are still here. Because the next chapter is where everything finally starts to explode. Let us continue with chapter 5. I read the permit document 3 times before I allowed myself to believe what I was seeing. Each time my eyes moved across the line that listed the property owner, the same name appeared. Samantha Blake, not Margaret Whitmore, not the name of the woman who had owned that house for nearly 20 years, just Samantha. For several minutes, I stood at the dining room table, holding the paper in my hands. The house was quiet, except for the distant sound of waves rolling toward the shore. That familiar sound usually comforted me, but in that moment, it felt strangely hollow. The problem was not simply that Samantha had written her own name on the form. The deeper wound was what it implied. That house represented decades of work. Daniel and I had sacrificed vacations, new cars, and countless small comforts to save for that piece of land. Seeing someone else claim ownership felt like watching our entire history disappear in a single line of ink. I knew I needed to speak to Ethan. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with his laptop open. His attention was fixed on the screen, and he barely looked up when I entered the room. For a moment, I hesitated, hoping the conversation might somehow resolve itself before it even began. But the document in my hand felt too heavy to ignore. I placed the paper on the coffee table in front of him and gently asked him to take a look. He leaned forward and glanced at the form with only mild curiosity. When his eyes reached the line listing Samantha as the homeowner, he frowned slightly but did not appear alarmed. Instead, he sighed in a way that made it seem like the entire situation was an inconvenience. He suggested that Samantha probably filled out the form that way simply because the permit required a contact name. According to him, it was probably easier for her to handle the paperwork directly since she was organizing the event. His tone implied that the issue was nothing more than a small administrative detail. His explanation left me stunned. I tried to explain that the document mattered because it erased the truth. That house did not belong to Samantha, and pretending otherwise could create serious legal problems. But the more I spoke, the more Ethan seemed impatient with the conversation. Then I mentioned the guest list. I told him I had seen the names, more than 150 people, and I told him that my own name was not anywhere on the list. For the first time, Ethan looked uncomfortable. Before he could respond, Samantha walked into the room carrying her phone. She stopped when she noticed the paper on the table and the tension between us. I explained what I had discovered and asked why she had written her own name on the permit. Samantha did not appear embarrassed or defensive. Instead, she spoke calmly, almost casually. She said the paperwork was easier that way and that she did not think it would matter. Then she shifted the conversation toward the party itself. She explained that many of the guests were important contacts from her industry. The evening needed to feel polished and professional. According to her, the atmosphere had to match the expectations of people who were used to high-end events. She paused briefly before adding that I might not enjoy that kind of environment anyway. The meaning behind her words was unmistakable. I was not part of the event. I looked toward Ethan, waiting for him to object or correct her. But he said nothing. He remained silent, staring down at the document on the table as if it were suddenly very interesting. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Later that night, while organizing the remaining event papers in the dining room, I noticed another printed document tucked between vendor contracts. It was an email conversation between Samantha and an event planning company. The message described my house as the perfect location for future luxury events. Samantha referred to the property as belonging to her family. That was the moment I understood the party was not just a celebration, it was the beginning of something much bigger. After discovering the email hidden among the event documents, I remained seated at the dining room table long after the sun began to lower over the ocean. The printed pages rested in front of me, and I kept reading the same lines again and again, hoping that somehow I had misunderstood their meaning. But the message was clear. Samantha had already begun discussing future events with a professional planning company. In her words, the house was described as a property belonging to her family. My family, not mine. The realization settled heavily in my chest. For years, that house had been a symbol of everything Daniel and I worked for together. Every plank in the porch, every coat of paint on the walls, every flower growing along the path carried a memory. Now it seemed that to Samantha those memories meant nothing at all. The house had become something else in her mind. A location, a venue, a business opportunity. Outside, the preparations continued. Through the open windows, I could hear workers assembling tables beneath the white tent in the yard. Someone tested the outdoor lighting, and strings of warm bulbs flickered on one by one between the trees. The catering staff arrived with boxes of glassware and trays of food. Each new arrival made the scale of the event more obvious. This was not the small gathering Samantha had described on the phone. This was a production. I stepped onto the porch and watched the activity in the yard. Samantha moved confidently among the workers, pointing toward different areas and giving instructions with the easy authority of someone who believed she was fully in charge. Her voice carried across the lawn as she directed where the bar should be placed and how the tables should be arranged. Ethan stood nearby, checking messages on his phone and occasionally nodding when Samantha spoke to him. He seemed distant, almost detached from the situation unfolding around him. When our eyes met briefly, he looked away. That small moment told me everything I needed to know. He was not going to step in. For a while, I remained there on the porch, watching the house transform into something unfamiliar. Music equipment arrived. Additional chairs were stacked near the tent. Someone rolled out a narrow carpet along the path leading from the driveway to the garden. Part of me wondered if it would be easier to simply leave and let the evening pass. I could drive back to my apartment in the city and pretend the entire situation had nothing to do with me. Perhaps it would avoid conflict with Ethan. Perhaps it would preserve whatever fragile peace remained between us. But as I stood there, another memory surfaced. I remembered the day Daniel and I first signed the paperwork for the land. We stood on that same porch, looking out over the water while the wind pushed against the wooden railings. Daniel had squeezed my hand and told me we had built something that would belong to our family for generations, not for strangers, not for business deals. As evening approached, the first cars began arriving along the road. Guests stepped out dressed in polished clothes, pausing to admire the ocean view as they walked toward the house. Laughter drifted across the yard, while music began playing softly under the tent. A few minutes later, Samantha approached me with a polite suggestion. She mentioned that the evening might feel crowded and that I might prefer spending some time in town instead. I nodded quietly. I collected my purse, walked to my car, and drove down the road until the house was still visible through the trees. From there, I watched the lights glow brighter as the party filled with people. Then I reached for my phone. I found the number for the Cape May Police Department, and I made the call. If you are still watching and wondering what decision I made next, comment number 6 below so I know you are still with me. Because the next chapter is the moment when everything changed for everyone involved. Now, let us move on to Chapter 7. After I ended the call with the Cape May Police Department, I remained in my car with both hands resting on the steering wheel. For a moment, I wondered if I had truly done it. The night air drifted through the open window, carrying the distant sounds of music and laughter from the house down the road. The party had already begun. From where I sat beneath a row of tall trees, I could clearly see the warm glow of lights hanging across the yard. Guests moved beneath the white tent like shadows against the soft yellow bulbs. Cars continued arriving one after another, their headlights sweeping across the gravel driveway before disappearing near the house. People stepped out dressed in elegant clothes. Some paused to admire the ocean view while others took photographs of the house before walking toward the music. The scene looked like something from a magazine advertisement. Beautiful, effortless, and completely detached from the quiet life that house had once represented. Watching it from a distance felt surreal. That porch, those windows, the garden along the path, Daniel and I had built every part of it with the simple hope that family would gather there one day. Instead, strangers were filling the space with loud conversations and flashing cameras. For a brief moment, I questioned my decision. Perhaps I should have let the night pass without interfering. Perhaps causing a scene would only damage what little remained of my relationship with Ethan. But then I remembered the email. I remembered the guest list, and I remembered the permit document that erased my name from my own property. Those thoughts settled the doubt. About 15 minutes after the call, flashing blue and red lights appeared at the far end of the road. The glow moved steadily closer until two police vehicles turned into the driveway, followed by a white truck from the local fire safety inspection office. Even from my distance, I could see people near the tent begin to notice the arrival. The music stopped. The lively conversations faded into confused murmurs as guests turned toward the driveway. Several people stepped away from the tent, watching as the officers approached the entrance to the yard. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder of the road. The night air felt cooler now, the ocean breeze brushing across my face as I began walking slowly toward the house. By the time I reached the gate, the entire mood of the gathering had changed. The bright music had been replaced by uneasy silence. Guests stood in small clusters, whispering to each other while watching the officers speak with Samantha near the porch. One of the officers noticed me approaching and asked if I was the person who had made the report. I confirmed quietly and explained that the property belonged to me. From my purse, I removed the folder containing the house documents and identification. He studied the papers carefully before nodding. Meanwhile, the fire safety inspectors began walking through the yard. They checked the tent structure, the electrical wiring connected to the lights, and the number of people crowded inside the space. Their expressions grew increasingly serious as they continued. Samantha stood near the steps of the porch, her earlier confidence completely gone. She spoke quickly to the officers, gesturing toward the decorations and the guests as if trying to explain that everything was under control. But the officers remained calm and firm. Within minutes, the decision was made. The event could not continue. Guests were instructed to gather their belongings and leave the property. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, people walking toward their cars with expressions of confusion and disappointment. I stood quietly beside the porch as the celebration unraveled around me. The party unraveled faster than I expected. Within minutes of the officers announcing that the event had to end, the energy that had filled the yard began to dissolve. Guests who had arrived smiling and confident now stood in small clusters beneath the tent, whispering to one another while they gathered their coats and purses. The music equipment had already gone silent, and the soft glow of the string lights now illuminated a scene that felt awkward and unfinished. Cars slowly began leaving the driveway. One after another, headlights swept across the gravel as people climbed into their vehicles and pulled away from the house. Some guests avoided looking toward the porch where the officers stood speaking with Samantha. Others glanced over curiously, trying to understand what had happened. The decorations that had seemed so festive earlier now looked strangely out of place. Half-filled glasses remained on tables. Plates of untouched food sat beneath the tent. The ocean breeze moved gently through the yard, rustling napkins and lifting the corners of tablecloths. I remained near the porch steps, watching quietly. Samantha stood several feet away, speaking with one of the officers. The confident composure she had shown earlier in the evening had disappeared. Her expression was tense, and her voice carried a sharp edge of frustration as she tried to explain that the event had been carefully planned. When she noticed me standing nearby, her gaze hardened immediately. Ethan approached a few minutes later. His face was pale, and there was a mixture of anger and disbelief in his eyes as he walked toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked why I had done this. His voice was not loud, but the disappointment in it was unmistakable. He told me that Samantha had spent weeks organizing the evening and that many important people from her professional network had been invited. According to him, the situation had embarrassed both of them. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I explained calmly that I had not ruined anything. I had simply stopped something that should never have been happening in the first place. The house belonged to me, and I had every right to decide what took place on the property. I also reminded him that I had not even been invited to the event. Ethan's expression shifted slightly when I said that. Before he could respond, Samantha stepped toward us. Her frustration had clearly turned into panic. She spoke quickly about the money already spent on the event and the contracts she had signed with vendors. The sudden cancellation meant she might still be responsible for paying those costs. For the first time that evening, Ethan seemed genuinely surprised. He asked Samantha what she meant. As the conversation continued, details began emerging that Ethan clearly had not known. I mentioned the permit listing Samantha as the homeowner. I also described the email I had discovered discussing plans to host future luxury events at the house. Ethan looked from me to Samantha, confusion replacing the anger on his face. The silence that followed felt heavy. Eventually, the last few cars pulled away from the driveway, leaving the yard quiet once again. Workers began packing equipment into trucks while the ocean waves continued their steady rhythm beyond the dark shoreline. I stood on the porch looking across the empty yard. For the first time that night, the house felt like mine again. If you are still watching and want to see how this entire story finally ends, comment number 8 below, so I know you stayed with me until the end. The final outcome may not be what you expect. Now, let us move toward the conclusion of the story. I woke before sunrise the next morning. Sleep had come in fragments during the night, interrupted by memories of flashing police lights, the sound of car doors slamming, and the look on Ethan's face when the officers told everyone to leave. When I finally opened my eyes, the house was silent in a way that felt both peaceful and unfamiliar. For a moment, I simply lay there listening. No music, no voices, only the faint sound of ocean waves rolling against the shore in the distance. I got out of bed and walked slowly through the house. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the catered food that had filled the air the night before. Chairs had been pushed against the walls, and several folded tables leaned near the doorway where the rental company had left them to collect later. Outside, the morning light revealed the aftermath more clearly. The gravel driveway showed fresh tire marks from dozens of cars that had left in a hurry. A few decorative ribbons had come loose from the tent poles and now drifted quietly in the ocean breeze. Workers had removed most of the equipment during the night, but the yard still carried the strange feeling of a celebration that had ended too suddenly. Standing on the porch, I looked out across the water. Despite everything that had happened, the view remained the same calm stretch of blue and silver that Daniel and I had loved when we first bought the house. The sight reminded me why protecting this place had mattered so much. My phone vibrated in my pocket. When I checked the screen, I saw several missed calls from Ethan, along with a handful of messages sent late during the night. Some sounded angry, others confused, but none of them offered any real understanding of what had taken place. I did not reply. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down on the porch steps, letting the quiet morning settle around me. About an hour later, I heard a car approaching slowly along the driveway. When I looked up, Ethan's car came into view. He stepped out without speaking and walked toward the porch. The tension in his shoulders had replaced the anger I had seen the night before. For a moment, he stood there in silence. Then he admitted that he had not known about the permit listing Samantha as the homeowner. He had also never seen the messages discussing future events being held at the property. Listening to him, I realized how much of the situation had unfolded without his full understanding. I explained calmly that the house represented years of work and memories that could not be treated like a rented venue. From now on, the property would remain under my control. Ethan nodded slowly. When he finally left, I remained on the porch watching his car disappear down the road. The future between us was uncertain, But one thing had become clear. For the first time in a long time, I had chosen to stand up for myself. Several days passed after the night the party ended. The house slowly returned to the quiet rhythm I had always loved. The rental tents were removed, the driveway was empty again, and the ocean breeze carried nothing but the steady sound of waves rolling toward the shore. Walking through the rooms, I could feel the calm settling back into the walls. For years, this house had represented something deeper than a simple place to live. Daniel and I built it together with patience and sacrifice. Every beam, every window facing the ocean held a memory of the life we had created side by side. Protecting it was never about winning an argument. It was about honoring everything that came before. The days after the confrontation were not easy. I thought often about Ethan and the distance that had grown between us. He eventually sent a short message saying he needed time to think. I understood that. Some truths take longer to accept than others. Samantha never contacted me again. At first, that silence bothered me, but over time I realized something important. Not everyone is willing to admit when they have crossed a line. Waiting for an apology can sometimes keep a person trapped in disappointment. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my own sense of peace. I began spending more mornings on the porch, watching the sunrise over the water, letting the quiet remind me of why this place mattered. The house felt steady again, as if it understood that it had been defended. Looking back, I know the decision I made that night changed many things, but it also taught me a lesson I wish I had learned sooner. Sometimes protecting your dignity begins with a single word. Sometimes the hardest battles in life are not fought with anger or loud words, but with quiet decisions made in moments of clarity. There comes a point when a person must recognize their own worth and protect the things that represent years of effort, love, and sacrifice. Respect cannot survive where dignity is ignored, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. When someone finally chooses to stand firm, it is not about revenge or pride. It is about remembering that self-respect is the foundation of every meaningful relationship. Life has a way of revealing who truly values the things that matter. And sometimes the greatest strength is simply having the courage to say no when your heart tells you it is time. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you in any way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.